Or excuse me,
20,
the
yeah.
end of 20 and
Yeah,
21.
in 20. You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. And as a matter of fact, Paul became part of a sacrifice in the temple. Okay. Yeah, I have no problem acknowledging that. The Jews weren't required to do that. Apparently, they felt like they needed to. God didn't command them, but He allowed them to continue with their practices.
So my last question would be, is there a law for Jews and a separate law for Gentiles?
No.
There's only one law, right?
Right.
One God, one Spirit, one law, one baptism. I think it's all.
Well,
I think
what
they
he's
go-
saying is...
But I'm saying, he's saying Jews, it's okay for Jews to keep this, but it's not necessary for Gentiles to have
Well,
to
it's
keep
not, he's saying it's not necessary for Jews either, so the law is the same for both.
Okay, but he's saying, but we're just reading that Paul is saying, we keep the law. We keep it.
Uh-huh.
And he's saying, also in Romans, he says, we establish the law. We don't do away with the law, yet we establish the law.
For what purpose, though? Establish it for the...
I think because he loves God, obviously. He loves God. So why would Jews have a separate standard if there's one law for both the Jew and Gentile?
We're not saying there was a separate standard.
No. This was something they thought they needed to do. It wasn't something we have any indication that they were commanded to continue
And
doing.
even they may not, some of them, the ones that understood things more fully, such as Paul, I think, would understand this is not something we need to do, and yet would still choose to, such as circumcising Timothy.
Yeah, okay, there's a good example. Yeah, Timothy, I mean, you're not even confident that circumcision is required today in Darien, but Paul had Timothy circumcised. Well, why? Well, I think the text there in Acts 16 tells us, because of the Jews in that area. Let me see exactly what it says. Verse 3, Paul wanted this man to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those parts, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. I take that as a way of saying, in order for Timothy to be effective in trying to reach these Jews, he needed to have Timothy circumcised. Mm-hmm. And Paul said in 1 Corinthians 9, to the Jews I became a Jew, to the Gentiles I became a Gentile,
Which I think explains his behavior when he went to Jerusalem.
Right, yeah, very good point,
But the point is, when Paul is keeping these laws, you said he didn't have to, but in Acts 18:21, it says, but bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that comes into Jerusalem.
Does he qualify that by saying, I must because this is God's law for me, or I must because that is my scheduling that I'm setting up for myself, and this is...
I think we're complicating it too much at that point. I think
Well,
we
I
ought
don't
to take
think
what
so.
the text is saying.
No, he's talking about his scheduling. He's saying, I will return to you, and he's explaining why he has to go. My scheduling is I gotta go. I'm aiming to get back to Jerusalem by the feast. He doesn't say why he has that strong aim.
Okay. One is that you just said he didn't have to, but here he is clearly saying he does. And when he goes into the temple again to explain, he's never spoken against the law or the temple. He's being very clear that he's not against it, and he's not saying it's done away with or abolished.
Where are you getting that? I must by all means keep this.
It's in the King
Acts
James
18:21. It's not in any other
21.
translation.
Okay, well, verse 16 says he was hurrying to be in Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. Okay.
He was hurrying. I mean, there's urgency there.
Unless you have something else you want to add to that at this point, I'd like if I may, close out with a reference to one other passage, because I do want to hear your response to that. You know, if I can summarize what I've been saying tonight, I've asked you, doesn't it bother you that, you know, there are no commandments, explicit commandments to keep the Sabbath? There are no examples of Christians, you know, explicitly keeping the Sabbath. And I think initially I made the point that it seems to me to be clearly the teaching of the New Testament, particularly several books of the Old Testament. I mentioned Romans and Galatians and Hebrews, that we're not under the law of Moses. And how do you cope with that? I'm just now trying to summarize what I've been saying. Another basic point that I would make, and this is where I'm coming to that scripture now. Sorry to take so long. Colossians 2. There are scriptures that explicitly say, or seem to say, that we are not to make the Sabbath day an obligation for people.
I'm sorry, is that a question or a statement?
That's a statement that's working its way into becoming a question to put to you, because I do want to hear your response to it. In Colossians 2, he says, and I'm very confident that you and Brigham have discussed this before, but I'd like to hear what you've got to say. In verses 16 and 17 it says, "Therefore let no one act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival, or a new moon, or Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." And he says, if we may go on a bit, in verse 20, "If you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why, as if you were living in the world, do you submit yourself to decrees such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which all refer to things destined to perish with using in accordance with the commandments and teachings of men?" So he seems to be saying there that, we don't have to keep the feast days, we don't have to keep the Sabbath day, we don't have to be concerned with food or drink. He says, why are you saying do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which seems to refer to the dietary laws, among other things. So not only do you not have a commandment to keep the Sabbath in the New Testament, but you seem to have Paul saying here explicitly, you cannot obligate people to keep the Sabbath.